Let me tell you something that most people never realize. Performing your way in life is going to destroy you way before failure ever does. Hey guys, my name is Julia Victoria. For those of you who don't know me, welcome. We're going to talk about performance and the performance epidemic and how a lot of people, me included, performed in every area of my life and maybe your life. And I never felt fulfilled. Okay, so I'm going to give you all throughout the video everything that I learned, everything that I have studied from the most successful people that are out there, realizations that I've had of what the world tells you, will lead to success, and how it actually just fuels performance and how it's not actually something that is fulfilling and not something that you're necessarily called to do. So I want to start today off by giving you guys an example of how I started, kind of cracking the success code and understanding why I felt so burnt out. And, growing up, just like all of you, probably, I was going to school, you're taught to get these amazing grades, and I was never really, talented in school. I never liked to do my homework, never did my homework. Except for history class, which, I was a beast in. I loved it so much. But apart from history and, arts, I wasn't that amazing in all of the other subjects. So I was basically taught that I was on the road to failure growing up because, when you're in school, you're taught that, if you get good grades and then you go to a good college and you do all these things, then you're going to feel fulfilled. Meanwhile, in my personal relationships, I never grew up surrounded by people who really implemented boundaries or taught me about boundaries, whether it be around friends or family or peers. I was taught that boundaries were something bad, communicating how you feel about something and what your limit is and what it isn't, is bad. And it's as if you're being rude to others. So that's where performance also came in. So I was performing to get good grades so that I could have a good career and hopefully have a satisfying life, which, that's what I was taught. So that it could lead to money, it could lead to influence, because that's what we were taught on what success actually was. You look at a very influential person and you're like, oh, they're so successful, but you don't actually know what they're going through in their lives. And we're going to get there here soon, but so I was performing in my relationships. I was performing in school trying to get these good grades. And I remember at 18 years old, when I finished school, I was like, okay, what do I do with my life? What am I called to? What do I like to do? And I just remember feeling this pressure because you have summer and then you kind of have to decide where you want to go, what you want to do with your life. And I remember just feeling completely lost because I knew that there were some things within me that I was, that just came so natural to me, but I couldn't see it in a way where I could use that in a career, and fit it in the world's standards. So I literally felt so anxious, so burnt out. I started getting everybody's opinions on what I should do with my life, things that were going to hopefully make me successful, schools that I should be going to so that I could get that degree that would get me from here to there, but it was all things I didn't even want to do. I didn't know who I was. I was full of trauma, didn't know what to do with my life. And so I remembered I had started my own company with, an idea that was creative. And so I was like, okay, this is something creative. Initially you have all this excitement when you're starting something new and you're like, oh, this is going to be it, But at the end of the day, it's not something that was really fulfilling me. It was something where I learned a lot of things. Yes, on some things I was using my creativity. On the other hand, I didn't feel so free with my creativity. So I was doing what the world was telling me to do, 22 years old, I had my company, was, onboarding a lot of companies and brands to partner with us in this venture. And I was doing all these things that look so successful from the outside, but I cannot tell you guys the anxiety, the doubts, the unfulfillment that I was feeling in my heart, because I didn't know who I was. I had never dealt with any of the traumas, growing up. I was constantly performing, constantly meeting people's expectations, and it was, I remember just waking up in the morning and I was like, something is going to happen from one day to the next where I don't have to, I don't have to keep on performing. I don't have to keep on being at everybody's beck and call. So this is where performance started to sneak up more than ever, and where I felt honestly completely lost, because at the end of the day, now in hindsight, I realized that I didn't know what success was. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know who I was. And that's the core issue, not knowing who you are. And there's an epidemic, in our world there's an identity crisis. And the reason for why we perform and for why we chase after all of these achievements, which at the end of the day, most of them are probably not going to fulfill us. Or if they do, it's like, it fulfills us for a week. I accomplished this thing. Now we're on to the next thing, And so it becomes like just you having a basket, and you label the basket as like, okay, this is my identity. And you need to pick all the apples, which are like all external achievements, in order to fill your cup, to feel fulfilled, to feel fulfilled. Okay? And I kept on doing that. I kept on chasing external achievements, also on I developed eating disorders because I was like, I need to be perfect. I need to be perfect with my body. Everything needs to be perfect. And I was never more unhappy in my life. So it really shifted when I kind of had a quote unquote awakening that came with failure. Okay. So that's why I mentioned, at the beginning of the video, how performance will destroy you way more than failure does, because performance is something that just blinds you. You keep on chasing after these things constantly, after these external achievements, things that maybe you're not even called to do, but that you're taught will make you successful. And so it's going to make you happy. And then you realize along the way that it never does. And so you try to find, oh, maybe it's this. Oh, maybe it's that. And maybe it's this. And then it's never that, because I tried 1,000 different things and it was never that. But my awakening came 4 years ago when I was at the lowest of lowest. I had an encounter with God. I know this sounds so cheesy. Okay, I was at the lowest and then God came and saved me. But I know this sounds really cheesy, okay? But I actually grew up in a Catholic home. Like my grandpa and my grandma, they were really believing. And I remember just being like, this isn't it, So I came from a background of, them talking about Jesus. And I remember them at every Christmas gifting us the gospel, because in Italy, I don't know if they also do this in the US or in other countries, but in Italy, they gift you just the 4 books of the gospel. So you have separate books that you can buy. And my grandparents would always gift us that. I just remember not wanting anything to do with it. So for me, to come at this realization after having lived with it kind of all my life, having people around me speaking about it, I never agreed with it all of my life. And then all of a sudden, I had this encounter with God, didn't know what to make of it. Slowly started, asking for help, asking for clarity. I started to ask questions about Jesus, the Bible, and all of these things. And I started to get so healed, because I had gone to, psychologists in the past and all these things. I'm not saying the psychologist is bad. Please, mind my words. I'm not a professional, but I'm talking about my own personal experience. And for me, going to a psychologist, maybe it was the wrong one. I don't know, but it didn't work out. Okay. It didn't work out. I just felt like, for me personally, I felt very off that I needed to pay a person to listen to me. Okay. It's just something that doesn't click with me. Okay. Style preference. It's not something that clicks with me. And so my friend, from church, she was actually a friend of mine in school that I hadn't spoken to in 10 years, but I had to remember that this girl was posting stuff about God. And I remember thinking she was a weirdo. But then at this point, after this encounter I had, I was like, okay, who do I ask? Who do I ask about these things? And so I texted her. And after 10 years, we started talking again. And I really, when finally things just start to click, okay, where I had been looking for all my life for answers. I'm not kidding. In my heart, I had been looking for answers, always searching things, always searching other groups and, doing stuff. And then I was looking at the new age stuff that people would tell you about, reading all these books. Never worked out for me, never had answers. I just felt it in my heart that it wasn't it. And then when I found God, that's where the performance mindset started to shift, and I started operating in that less and less. And so I started burning out less because I knew, and because God was revealing to me my identity. How does he reveal your identity? Well, first and foremost, there's a lot of trauma in our lives, and that can really overshadow who you are, the things that you love. Maybe you had a bad experience with something, and maybe that was meant to be connected to what you're called to do. But since you had a bad experience with it in the past, just like I had a bad experience with Jesus growing up, not with Jesus, but with religion growing up, and so I thought that God was this thing here, I excluded it. And it could be the same for you in another area of your life where you're like, oh my gosh, I hate this. But actually, maybe it's something that you're actually called to implement. And so he needed to remove all this trauma, everybody's voices, like growing up, like, oh, this is going to make you successful. Maybe it's your parents' voice, whispering to you in your mind, like, oh my gosh, if I don't do this, then my parents won't approve of me. Or it's, everybody's external opinion that then just makes you go into this performance mode where you're like, okay, if I don't do this, I'm not going to please this person and they're going to reject me. And so you got to heal the trauma. I started to heal the trauma. God started to reveal my identity, and he started to bring to light the gifts that he had always placed in me, which is also one of the points of how to get out of performance. It's to identify your gift. This is biblical. There's a verse in the Bible that says, in Proverbs, I believe, a gift is going to make room for you and place you in front of great people. So it's not your passion. I was passionate about coloring. I was passionate about horse riding. I was passionate about tech. I was passionate about 3,500 different things. But maybe I'm called to implement small things, small skills of those things into my actual gift, which I personally believe, is encouraging people, telling the truth. I feel like it's something that God has gifted me with. And initially I couldn't find, I didn't know, okay, God gave me a gift of encouragement. I've always had this. Everybody has always told me, Julia, you should do this. You should be a coach. You should do this. And I was like, how do you, how do I even go about this? And how do I make a living out of this? How, how can I sustain myself with this? And then, it's not up to you to figure out. So started doing all these things, slowly in my process with God. I started allowing him to heal me, just like I was praying. I was reading the word of God. So I finally related to people. I didn't feel so lost. I started to get clarity on things, because also a lack of clarity is going to lead you to be double-minded about things. So I was always confused. Am I supposed to do this? Well, what if this happens? And what if this happens? Or am I supposed to do this? And then every single time I never had clarity. And only by reading the Bible did I understand specific things. And I got clarity. And so I didn't operate in that confusion constantly, but it's a process. It's a process, but performance is literally an epidemic. And the root of performance and burnout is a lack of identity. If you look around, and I was also reading an article about how the Secretary General of the United Nations, I think his name is Antonio Guterres, I don't want to butcher his name, but he was saying how our society is becoming unhinged. And at the same time, a Harvard professor was observing how at the same time, the society is becoming unhinged, but we have never had more progress in humanity ever. Like we live in the era of AI. We have the best cars we've ever had. The planes are hopefully working the best they've ever worked. We have all these tools, we have all these courses we can take, all these things. And yet, how is it that our society is becoming unhinged? And my conclusion is because there is a lack of identity. And I got this answer by reading the Bible. And I know it can sound a little bit crazy to some of you listening. Maybe you're not, maybe you don't believe in God. But this is also for you. Like I studied for 2 years the stories, the testimonies of all the most successful entrepreneurs, like the most successful people out there, from actors to startup founders to scientists as well. Albert Einstein said he believed that there was a superior intelligence. I'm going to put his quote right here, which I wrote in my book, that is going to come out talking about exactly about this, about success and redefining success. But Albert Einstein also observed that there's a superior intelligence. So if you're gonna try to understand what your issues are in life and you're gonna exclude God and spirituality in general from it, I hate to tell you that you're probably not gonna have that void filled. You can't, because it's an issue that literally comes from Genesis 3, from the fall of mankind. When Adam and Eve sinned, the first human emotion that entered, I mentioned this before, was shame. Shame attacks your identity. It wasn't fear that entered. It wasn't pride that entered. Satan in the garden and in our lives in general, he wants to attack your identity. How does he do that? He does that by bringing shame. And shame can speak to you in so many different ways. And it usually is when you have thoughts like, I'm not enough. I always do this, but I'm never enough. I am not wanted. Maybe you were abandoned by your parents. And so you developed an identity of, I am not wanted. Okay. You were rejected. I am not enough. Somebody commented on your body. Oh my gosh, I am ugly. So I have to lose weight. So I have to do this. So I have to do that. So it leads, this lack of identity, this fractured identity leads you to taking external things, which can be external achievements, to cover that shame up, to cover that I am within you, to hopefully, heal it. And the only person who can actually reveal your identity to you again, because it was fractured because of an existential issue. We live in a fallen world, okay? So I had that problem. You're going to have that problem. Every single person out there, every single entrepreneur out there, and I've studied them for 2 years, going on morning walks at the park, literally listening to all of these people's testimonies. All of them tell you to have a relationship with God. Put God first in everything you do. This is Denzel Washington. Steve Harvey was homeless in his car for 3 years before becoming the comedian he is today. And he's also helping so many people along the way. They're all going to tell you to ask God. Every single one of them. Literally at Charlie Kirk's memorial, the U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, said it's a spiritual war.
But over time, he realized, like so many of us have, that this is not a political war. It's not even a cultural war. It's a spiritual war. Faith and family first. There is a God, and as Charlie would say, it is not us. We're sinners saved only by grace in need of the gospel. You see, we always did need less government. But what Charlie understood and infused into his movement is we also needed a lot more God.
So these aren't people who are delusional, who are, walking on a cloud, who are literally believing in roses and rainbows. I mean, this is the U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, telling you that it is a spiritual war. Go and read the testimonies of all of the most successful people. Go and read the testimony of Sylvester Stallone. He wrote Rocky in 3 days, and he said, it couldn't have been me. It was channeled through me by God. Literally. And so reading Genesis 3, you will understand why what Antonio Guterres, in my opinion, says, our society is becoming unhinged. And it's because at the same time, there's this incredible progress. We have mastered material things, but at the same time, we have never been chasing external things more than we have now, especially with social media. That is why our society right now has become more unhinged than ever. And it's because we live in an area of social media, of appearance. And so people constantly try to take these external things to cover themselves up, just like Adam and Eve did in the garden after they sinned, after their identity was fractured. And they took fig leaves to cover themselves because they didn't feel comfortable being vulnerable anymore. Where in Genesis 2, before sinning, they said they were naked, but they felt no shame. Now, after sin entered, after, we chose, because our decisions have power, after we chose to disobey God and our relationship with him was fractured because a whole other desire, a whole other set of things came in and stole from our identity, then we started having all of these issues, all of these questions about who we are, why are we called to be here. We started taking fig leaves, trying to cover ourselves. So the fig leaves, in the Bible in Genesis 3, literally could be busyness, performance, achievements that you try to accomplish at work constantly in order for people to look at you, to admire you, so that you can fill in that void of who you are, that shame. And so it is an issue that is spiritual. You need to have a relationship with God. I can tell you personally, because, I'm not a person who was literally walking on roses and rainbows. I'm going to use this example, but, I have an entrepreneurial background. I worked also in finance. I could have been very logical. And if I'm here telling you, I've tried all these things, I've listened to all the testimonies, I'm writing a book about it, with all the biblical success principles and how all these people applied them in their words, their advice, what they're saying, believe me when I'm telling you, I never heard of a better solution. I haven't. God gives you a standard of righteousness. He guides you in a world that teaches you and tells you, oh, you're supposed to do this to be fulfilled. You're supposed to do this. And then you go and try out all those ways and they don't fulfill you, and you feel so lost. Reading, the Bible, which is literally a manual for your life, which tells you don't do this because it's going to lead you in a bad place. You're like, okay, now I know that this is not good, but I know that this is good. And then God is going to guide you. He's going to reveal things to you. And so slowly, instead of going on all these wrong paths, you could take 1,000,000 courses in your life. But which one are you called to take? You could do all these things, all these careers, but which one are you called to do with your skill sets, with your, with the time that you personally need, with your needs? Which one are you called to do? Not all of them are going to fulfill you. And so it's essential that we, read the Bible and have a relationship with God so he can kind of refine all of the things that you learned that didn't come from him, that weren't necessarily things that you should be doing, with the skill sets that you have, with how you are built, and so that he can show you and open doors for you that no man can open. And so literally, guys, there's an epidemic. I'm going to read some statistics that I found, because while I was writing my book proposal to send to agents, I started literally looking for statistics of burnout in the world today, because I just felt this so strongly. I was like, it's so weird that God guided me for all these years, to go to the park, listen to all these entrepreneurs and scientists and all these people's testimonies and what they tell you is success and everything. And then I went back home, read my Bible. Literally, I was in a phase where I didn't have many friends. God was just healing a lot of things that had happened to me, a lot of trauma. So he was refining me. And, I was like, it's weird that he guided me to do all of this, to kind of redefine success. Okay. So it's not necessarily the accomplishment of an aim or purpose, which is how the Oxford Dictionary defines success. Success for them is the accomplishment of an aim or purpose. But I was reading a book one day of John Maxwell, and he said that success is knowing your purpose in life, growing to reach your maximum potential, and sowing seeds that benefit others. So see how success is not just something that you do and something that you achieve, but it's growing, knowing your purpose. And to know your purpose, you need to have a relationship with God, because your purpose is the reason for why you are created and exist. And so for that, you got to kind of go back to the source. Like, why do I exist? Why am I here? You got to go back to the source. You got to ask God. You got to have a relationship with him. So I just started to redefine all these things. I was like, this is not random. So, I was like, one day I was like, let me get some statistics. Let me see if anxiety has grown, like how the burnout situation is and stuff like that. And I want you to listen to me very carefully, because everything that I had been observing, everything that God was speaking to me in these years is confirmed by data. It's confirmed by data. So here we go. 57% of young professionals under 35 feel unfulfilled in their current work and lack a sense of purpose. This is McKinsey. 53% of millennials report feeling burnt out most or all of the time, the highest of any generation. Okay? This is from Gallup, and I'm going to put the link in the description. 58% of young adults ages 18 through 25 say they lack meaning or purpose in life. Okay? This is according to Harvard. So this is not like according to my spiritual parent, we're all burnt out. No, this is according to Harvard, honey. This is according to Gallup. It's according to McKinsey. Okay? It's not according to, my delusions. This is data. Okay? So 36% of young adults identify ongoing anxiety as one of their top personal challenges. Harvard again. Diagnosed anxiety among adolescents rose 61% between 2016 and 2023, increasing from 10% to 16.1%. U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration 2023. I mean, I can keep going. This is long. 70% of young professionals say they would change jobs to find work that offers more meaning. Yet again, we want purpose nowadays. We have understood in a world that, is constantly talking to you about material things, that this stuff does not actually fulfill you. And I can tell you, because I've grown up speaking to entrepreneurs that are at the top of their games, And when I gave them my testimony about God, when they're glued to you and tell us something that is actually going to make us feel full, because we have been here and we haven't found the answers. So I have spoken to these people. I've sat in these circles, and I can tell you the answer is not there. The answer is not in how much money you make and how much influence you have. That influence can be used in terrible ways. But when you sow seeds that benefit others, like John Maxwell defined success, that is something different. It is different. When you know your purpose in life, when you grow as a person, as a human being, you begin to build confidence. It's a completely different thing, okay? And yet, Bible engagement among Gen Z has risen by 14% since 2021, American Bible Society, and 74%, this is very interesting, 74% of adults now identify as spiritual, a 12% increase from a decade ago, Pew Research Center 2023. So this was in 2023. So notice how now, instead of looking to all these material things that have never been there more, people are actually starting to ask questions. They're actually starting to understand that, this isn't actually, the success picture that people told us we would have, and the money and the influence. And then all your actors that have so much money and influence, like some of my favorite actors, I remember Robin Williams, hearing the news of Robin Williams, commit suicide. Now, I don't know all the reasons. Please go and read that yourself. But, just my personal experience, when I listened to that, I was like, that's so strange. I was little. I wasn't that, it was years ago. I remember thinking, oh, that's so strange, that a person who was at the top of their game, he was an incredible actor. He was brilliant, and he committed suicide. I was like, that's so strange, because, usually people like that, in my mind at the time, were like, usually people like that are like the happiest people. And actually, no. So it can't be that. If success was having money and influence, why are people at the top of their game committing suicide? It's weird. Okay, it's weird. So I literally went into all of these things, started listening to all the testimonies, started to kind of understand and crack the success code. And I understood that everything that we were told, that everything that I was told at least, wasn't it. It wasn't it. And now I'm seeing it by the numbers. And these sources are not backing up any of my claims, obviously. Please go read it for yourself. This is my observation, my personal observation. But I mean, the data is there. And even the Secretary General of the United Nations observed how our society is becoming crazy, unhinged. I want to close off with this and with just a few tips so that you can start, getting out of that performance epidemic. Because it doesn't mean that we're not supposed to work hard. Performance, though, is when you're doing all of these things to fill yourself up, to be something so that people will approve of you. And it's like you start operating and burning out, striving so that you can, fill that void. That's performance to me. And doesn't mean, like I mentioned, that we don't have to, give our excellence, because God calls us to give our excellence and to do everything not for humans, but as if we are doing it for the Lord. And so to the Lord, we give our excellence. But, he releases a grace over it. Like if he's actually calling you to do something and you see yourself striving and killing yourself and being completely unhappy and having burnouts every 2 seconds, I mean, that's not normal. That's probably not something that God is calling you to do. Because if he were calling you to do it, he'd release a grace for it. Now, I'm not saying that we're never going to have resistance, because there's a lot of times when maybe you're called to something and you can feel that there's resistance, and maybe that's a call to actually do it. You can kind of push doors open here and there, see if, that's something that God is calling you to do and if he's going to release a grace. But if it's like a constant where you're constantly striving and unhappy, I mean, I'd rethink again. So I forgot what I was supposed to tell you guys, but I remember just a few tips that you can implement right away are: ask God what your purpose is. Ask him to guide you. Literally ask him with your heart, like ask him, okay, God, if you exist, like guide me. And then ask him what your gift is. Ask him to reveal to you what your gift is, because it's, it's not your passion that's gonna lead you to your purpose. Like if God has a purpose for you, which he has one, he released specific gifts for you to accomplish that purpose. And so you need to ask him what those gifts are. You need to ask him what those gifts are, so that if you're doing other things, that aren't your gift, you're going to be like, okay, see, this is where I'm performing and where God isn't calling me to operate in. So let me change that. And so you can start tweaking things with God's guidance, for you to actually operate in your purpose and for you to figure out what your gifts are, for you to have more peace of mind, because when you're operating in something that you're gifted at, it comes natural. So all this striving isn't there, like you're not striving constantly. And then kind of maybe jot down, what are things that are stealing your peace? Like, what are things that you're doing even in your relationships, like where you're performing? Like, and it can sound like this. If I don't do this for my wife, she's going to leave me, If I don't look a certain way, nobody is ever going to love me. So this doesn't mean that we don't have to be healthy, but, it can become something excessive where we're constantly striving. So yeah, just write down some thoughts here and there, because we need to start having clarity. We need to start having clarity. I believe that, by knowledge, the righteous shall be delivered. This is a Bible verse. And when you have knowledge about something, you have clarity, you catch something that you're doing that you subconsciously didn't know that you were doing way better. So yeah, guys, I wanted to leave you with these thoughts. I really want to know what your thoughts are in the comments. And if you have any tips, any tips for like extra things that we can really think about to break off this loop, this performance thing that came with a lack of identity. Okay. Thanks for listening. Bye.